During the last few years, especially around the refugee crisis in 2015-16, vigilante groups popped up all over Europe and North America, patrolling the streets and national borders. They claimed to protect the local citizenry against crime and security threats constituted by illegal migrants and minority groups. I co-edited a volume called Vigilantism against Migrants and Minorities with my colleague Miroslav Mares from the Czech Republic. We are tracing the rise of far-right vigilante movements in a comparative international perspective. And based on new empirical data from 17 countries, it focuses on the internal organization of these groups, on their external justifications, group strategies and individual motivations, as well as on the circumstances that facilitate their emergence, breakthrough and decline. Wait a minute. While the most popular understanding of vigilantism is to take the law into one's own hands, vigilante practices generally configure organized civilians that act in a policing role without any legal authorization, who use or display a capacity for violence and claim that the police or other authorities are not unable or unwilling to handle a perceived crime problem. In this respect, a core feature of vigilantism is that it's usually biased. Vigilantes tend to direct their attention towards certain marginalized groups in society, such as ethnic minorities or migrants accused of being potential criminals or threats to collective security or to the social and moral order. So it's no surprise then that the Roma peoples have been the targets of aggressive vigilante activities across multiple European countries, but also more recently migrants of different kinds. So our question was in this volume, how do these vigilante groups operate and how are they organized? What are the external justifications, the group strategies and individual motivations behind this form of vigilante activism? And under what circumstances do these vigilante activities emerge, flourish or fail? In our research, we could identify at least 4 main types of contemporary vigilante activities. The first time is what we call vigilante terrorism, pogroms and lynchings. And the classic case of vigilante terrorism is of course the Ku Klux Klan lynchings of blacks or other minorities, usually accused of having committed crimes or breaking the so-called moral order of white supremacy. This image is of a lynching of 3 black men in Duluth, Minnesota in June 1920, probably not committed by Ku Klux Klan but by relatively ordinary citizens. These 3 young men were accused of raping a young girl, but evidence was very, very unclear. Similar events took place in Russia with a murderous campaign against migrants and homosexuals, especially between 2006 and 2010, when vigilante violence lasted for several years. Another extreme case of vigilante terrorism was a series of murders of Roma people in Hungary in 2008 to 2009, where a killer commando of 4 perpetrators killed 10 people, including a child, and wounded 6 more when they attacked Roma villages with guns. They justify their actions by claiming that they intended to take revenge for so-called gypsy crimes and provoke violent reactions from the Roma to trigger an ethnic civil war. In reality, their victims were selected randomly. Another main type is what we call paramilitary or militia movements. Militias can be distinguished from other forms of vigilantism because they are modeled on a military style and a form of organization. The Hungarian Guard marched here through a Roma village in this image. Participants usually wear military-like uniforms, perform parades and marches, have a structured chain of command and train in military skills, sometimes also with firearms. In Central and Eastern Europe, there is a long tradition of paramilitary militias, often affiliated with parties on the extreme right. In recent years, the most significant initiative was the establishment of the Hungarian Guard in 2007 as a militia wing of the far-right party Jobbik in Hungary. The Hungarian Guard was tasked to protect Hungarian citizens against so-called gypsy crimes, sometimes marching through Roma villages and neighborhoods to intimidate the inhabitants. This Hungarian Guard were banned, but they also were got inspired similar movements in other Eastern European countries. A third type is what we call vigilante border patrols. Border patrol groups emerged when the issue of the arrival of refugees or undocumented migrants is high on the political and media agenda. Claiming that the governmental border agencies are unable to fulfill their tasks, some activists volunteered to help, so-called protecting the borders. In Bulgaria, vigilante border patrols affiliated with the far-right political parties have patrolled the border to Turkey and even arrested undocumented migrants. There were also some rather sophisticated attempts to demonstrate the government's lack of capability to control EU borders against migrants. In the case we had also in the Mediterranean with a ship run by far-right groups, and also in the Franco-Italian Alps, the so-called Defend Europe campaign by the identitarians displayed border control and allegedly contributed to discourage rescue operations by NGO. A common feature of vigilante border patrols is that they very rarely actually detect or apprehend undocumented migrants crossing the borders. Their activities appear to be completely symbolic. They make an attempt to demonstrate the willingness of vigilantes to protect their own country as a preventive measure in case of need. They also want to demonstrate that the government is not able to do its best against migration. In this respect, vigilantism represents mainly a media strategy and a recruitment tactic more than an actual intervention in the territories crossed by migration. The fourth type is what we call vigilante street patrols. This is probably the most common type of vigilante activities against migrants and minorities. These street patrols, which are organized groups that walk together in the streets or near so-called sensitive places with the stated goal of providing protection to local inhabitants. This group is the so-called Soldiers of Odin in Norway. I actually followed this group this evening when the images were taken. These groups typically claim that their presence will deter criminals and provide a sense of safety to the most vulnerable citizens, in particular women and children. Typically, patrolling activities emerge in the aftermath of criminal events, especially if migrants or minorities have been involved or as alleged perpetrators. Frequently, these actions are more or less directly sponsored by radical right-wing organizations and parties, which seize opportunity to promote their group at the local level. At times, however, patrols are organized by concerned citizens without any particular political sponsorship. Some of these groups maintain that they will only observe and report incidences to the police. Other groups take a more active stance by intending to deter or even intervene against acts of crime. Obviously, this may represent a challenge to the police monopoly on the legitimate use of force. We also ask, why do we get these vigilante activities? What are the external justifications, which are often the claim that they want to protect the community against certain crime threats? They claim to be helpers, they claim to be altruistic, but they also try to fine-tune their activities to resonate with widely held concerns in society. For example, in the context of the massive influx of refugees to Europe during 2015, this caused fears at many levels, and in particular fear of rape against European women by Muslim males. And you can see from this on the right here is a front page of a Polish magazine, Islamist Rape of Europe. You can see these dark hands ripping off the European flag. and also the so-called refugees not welcome, with Angela Merkel in this poster, who is blamed for letting these so-called refugees into Germany. We also have group strategies for vigilant activities that internally these groups argue that they need to engage in vigilantism because it's a useful propaganda tool, it's useful for recruitment, and they also clearly want to undermine the legitimacy of the authorities. And finally, we have individual motivation. Why individuals join these groups may not necessarily be in line with the official justification. It could be that they want to improve their own personal identity and status. We've seen that many of these young men have a criminal record, and this is an opportunity to be sort of present themselves as good guys who help to protect society against dangerous criminals and protect women against rape and so on. Some of them are also fascinated with militarism or uniforms, and it may be an exciting activity and so on. But here you have this example of how these people present themselves as a good guy, protecting young vulnerable girls safely home after a night on town where they are drunk and so on. I happen to know these two guys, and they have a long criminal record. So also we ask why. Well, first of all, although many of these vigilante groups make use of violence, or at least some of them, and in particular the first type, those who do terrorism and hangings and lynchings and so on, most of these groups do actually not carry out much violence. They primarily display a violent capacity through the performance of violence or performance of force, whether they parade as a paramilitary militia with or without weapons. They may patrol the streets in groups dressed up with group symbols or uniforms, but their display of force is intended to have an intimidating and deterring impact on the designated target groups as well as political opponents. And then we move to the question, why do these vigilante groups or movements emerge and flourish? And the first context is that they tend to emerge in situations characterized by a widespread perception of crisis and threat to one's society and lifestyle. This may cause fear among sections of the population, which is exacerbated by extensive media campaigns and far-right propaganda. A particularly sensitive issue is the perceived threat of sexual assaults against native women. And also vigilantism tends to flourish when perceptions of threats are easily associated with specific groups, such as the marginalized Roma populations in parts of Europe, or refugees in Europe, or Muslim migrants, and also with the so-called flood of Latinos across the US borders, for example. A second context is when you have had specific shocking events that may cause moral panic that trigger vigilante activities. One such turning point in Europe were the events on New Year Eve between 2015 and 16 in Cologne, Germany, where large numbers of local women were sexually harassed and abused by men of mainly North African and Middle Eastern origin. And this event triggered vigilante responses in many countries and boosted in particular street patrols like the Soldiers of Odin and others. And during the first few months of 2016, Soldiers of Odin and similar vigilante groups popped up all over Europe and even in Australia and North America, with this claim to protect women against dangerous migrants and refugees. A third contextual factor is the perception that the police and other authorities are either unable or unwilling to protect the citizens from threats to their safety, and this is a major factor facilitating the emergence of vigilantism. More generally, vigilantism is closely associated with a lack of trust in governmental institutions and the police in particular. The Eurobarometer shows that many of the countries with relatively strong and persistent persistent tendencies towards vigilantism, such as Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, score low or relatively low on trust in governmental institutions, whereas countries where vigilante movements have more difficulties in finding a lasting foothold, such as Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, they score high on trust in governmental institutions and the legal system. The United States, with a long legacy of vigilantism and militia, is also characterized by a low trust in governmental institutions among large sections of the population. Moreover, countries with a permissive legislation for armed self-defense and civil patrols provide opportunities for vigilantism. The liberal laws in the USA on gun ownership and the right to use armed force for self-defense and for protecting your property goes very far in legalizing vigilantism. In most European countries, application for gun permits would be turned down flatly if the reason given was self-protection. That's not so in the USA. Finally, vigilantism is facilitated by historical embeddedness of a tradition of vigilantism and militias. Again, the United States is a special case with its Wild West history of frontier justice and lynchings and a popular culture and film industry where vigilantism, street justice and revenge are main themes. This historical and cultural dimension in the United States may facilitate a widespread mindset where vigilantism becomes a natural response to perceived threats. In Central and Eastern Europe, there are also historical traditions of fascist militias, especially during the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s, and this has served as a model and inspiration to modern-day extreme right parties and movements to establish paramilitary militias. We find this in countries like Italy, Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Vigilantism thrives in society where there is a base of support for vigilantism against the public and among political parties. Most vigilante groups described in our case studies put a lot of efforts into gaining support from the public and recognition from the police and the government, albeit in most cases with limited or no success. Vigilantism thrives when the police and other authorities turn a blind eye to it, even tacitly accept and actively support it. Under these circumstances, vigilante practices turn more violent. The Ku Klux Klan lynchings and the murderous attacks on migrants and homosexuals in Russia are examples of how such violent campaigns could continue unhindered for a long time. So, what makes vigilantism decline and fail? The appeal of vigilante responses become less persuasive or it comes to an end under certain circumstances. One factor here is when the perceived threat is reduced or appears less acute. For example, when media attention moves away from issues of migration and security. Also, when the police and other authorities are able to demonstrate that they are in control of the situation, vigilantism may get less support. This is because diffusion of vigilantism is directly related to the level of trust in the police and other authorities. In countries and cities where the police is generally respected and trusted by most of the populations, initiatives to establish vigilante patrols to provide safety in the streets will usually fall flat. When there is a lack of support by the public or by organized political actors or the news media, also vigilantism tend to fail or lose foothold. For example, the Norwegian Soldiers of Odin, which did not get support from any political parties, not from the police, nor from any significant part of the public, very quickly lost steam. When the police and other authorities strike down hard on vigilante violence and hate crime, this is also usually the end of vigilante activities. This was the case with the Ku Klux Klan from the 1970s onwards, due to increased legal prosecutions, increased FBI surveillance and infiltration by the police. Similarly, restrictive legislation on vigilantism and police enforcement of such laws does reduce the leeway of vigilante activities and may even put an end to it. And finally, when the extreme right movements sponsoring vigilante activities, they also have a tendency to split. They turn into internal conflicts, and internal conflicts over ideology, strategy, methods, money, or leadership often leads to splinters into several small and weakly organized groups. While some of these groups may turn towards violence, they are also generally more easily targeted by law enforcement. So I mentioned we edited a volume on this topic. This book is available in open access. It means that you may download it for free, and you can just Google the title, Vigilantism Against Migrants and Minorities, and you'll find it at Routledge webpage, and you can find the open access page and download it for free, either individual chapters or the entire volume. So you're welcome. And with this, I thank you for the attention.